So these are these yellow bricks that were made in Pollagh, probably from about the mid 1800s up until about the 1920s. And they're kind of a distinctive yellow colour, and they're made from this blue clay that can be found along the River Brusna, which is kind of just over beyond here. And brickmaking was a big source of employment in Pollagh for I don't know, 70 or 80 years, and they're very famous. Like around here, they're used a lot in a lot of the older houses, in the church, and in the school. Yeah.
And that here inside the cat here, that's one of the moulds, is it?
This is one of the moulds, yeah. So I think what's unusual, or handmade bricks were made all over the country, but I think what's interesting is that they were made for maybe a lot longer in Ireland than they were in the UK, where like industrial processes came in. So in Ireland, a lot of the time, these handmade bricks continued well into the 20th century. It was a really laborious process. You had to dig the clay, you had to shape it and shear it and sour it, and all sorts of processing had to happen. And then you had to, the moulder was the person who kind of, now you probably won't fit back into the mould, but the moulder was the person who kind of worked with the bricks at the table and used the mould to make the bricks. And that was like a really skilled job. And then you'd have a couple of young kids, like usually boys or girls, they were called off bearers. And once the brick was moulded by the moulder, they'd be taking them off immediately as fast as they could off the table and laying them out in big rows. And you'd be looking at, they'd maybe make about 5,000 bricks in a day. So it was a huge amount of work. Very, like, probably only working from early in the morning until maybe lunchtime, because they'd have other things to do. But it was a hard job.
And is the brickyard still there?
There's brickyards all around, yeah, but I mean, there's very little remaining in terms of what you can see. What you'll see around here is in the landscape is big holes, pits, where they would have dug the clay. So that's the main remnant. Also, I suppose the other remnant of this process is that you'll see bricks and pieces of bricks everywhere. Like that would have been, so they built a big kiln, like it was called a clamp kiln, and through the kiln there was all these passages, and turf would go into the passages, and that would be set on fire, and there'd be a process of 4 or 5 days where the kiln would burn, and that'd be great crack. Apparently, people would have to stay up all night, keeping the fire alive, and that used to be, apparently was good crack. And then so interestingly, if you go around any of the fields around here, there's bricks, whether from kilns or from houses or whatever, but there's loads of, all the way along the canal when they were digging the new greenway, there's loads of just random pieces of brick, like everywhere. It's just everywhere in the landscape here.
So they'd go to dig down, they'd get the clay and they'd make them there on that spot, and then go into another hole, do the same again?
Yeah, I think they kind of kept excavating along when they'd find a good seam.
Yeah.
But different families owned the brickyards, so each family would have their own, so I guess they'd be kind of close to the source, and that'd be their spot where they'd dig, and then they'd build a kiln, and then they'd fire the kiln, and so on.
So it was like a small little family industry?
Small, yeah. We think there was about 13 brickyards in Pollagh at one point. Now, some of them maybe were a little bit more like maybe owned by a company or something, because there was I suppose it was a family brickyard, you weren't really necessarily paying your staff. But here, I think for some, we did hear about this thing called a chit, which was if you were working on a brickyard who was maybe owned by a company, they wouldn't pay you in cash, they'd pay you a chit, and the chit was a voucher that you could then go and use in a shop in Tullamore to buy your groceries.
And what are you really going to be talking about?
I think we think, like, so it started with when the canal came, that's when they found the clay, but we think the actual brick making was probably biggest between the 1850s up until the early 1920s or so. So when the cement block came along, that kind of killed the brick.
And what's there evidence of bricks before that, do you know?
We think there is a story that apparently they made bricks like in the 1700s, maybe Cromwell soldiers, and before that, when Cromwell soldiers were coming across, that's some we've heard through kind of rumours and oral histories that people said that was one thing people thought that's when they found the clay, because those soldiers would have known that they recognised the type of clay. And also the words used for the process, all the moulder, the shearing, the souring, I know they're all English words, even when some Irish words would have stayed around for cutting turf. So there is it's kind of a theory that it was obviously brought over by the Brits at some point. And then we think at some point, before the canal was built, there was someone said that there was bricks made around here and they were pulled along the river. But men had to pull them along a boat along the river to Ballycumber. But we've no real evidence for that.
Yeah.
So the most plausible theory about when it really got started was when they were mapping and surveying for the canal, that they found these seams of clay and thought these are. And then there was a brickmaking ban in Dublin in the 1700s, in the late 1700s. So the canal was maybe coming here in the early 1800s. So we think that kind of pushed brickmakers out to other places, and maybe then the habit or the practice of making bricks kind of spread to here as a result of that.
And the last thing I want to ask you, where did the bricks end up?
Oh, everywhere. They definitely went back up the canal on barges to Dublin, and we think they were used a lot in Dolphin's Barn and Rialto, around that part of town, because that's kind of was where the bricks would have been taken off. Around here for houses, for the school, all the brickmakers donated a week's work, or one day's work a week towards the bricks that were made in a day were donated to the church, so that the church was built with local brickmakers' bricks. In the school, just generally around. And in Tullamore, the old hospital was built. There's a lot of buildings in Tullamore that would have been built with Pollagh brick as well.
And all using those little things you are holding in your hand.
Yeah.
That simple.
Yeah, very simple process, very hard work. Every brick would have been handled multiple times. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks a million for that.
Okay.
Grand. And it's still industrious area because someone's cutting sticks behind us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's probably my cousin.